In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a celebrated painter vanishes, leaving behind a chilling canvas splashed with crimson. Was it blood or a lie? Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels a web of deceit spun by 4 suspects: a loyal apprentice, a proud patron, a secretive model, and a cunning dealer. As whispers of betrayal and forgery surface, a hidden room reveals the truth, sinister plot to steal an artist's soul. Can Miss Marple paint the picture of a crime before the final stroke falls? Chapter 1. The Empty Studio. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, softening the outlines of the village's thatched cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the scene. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favorite armchair by the bay window of her neat parlor, was engaged in her usual occupation, knitting a pale pink shawl while observing the world beyond her laced curtains. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, the click of needles a steady counterpoint to her thoughts, which were, as always, alert to the subtle currents of village life. It was a habit born of years spent noting the small, telling details that others overlooked: the way a postman lingered at a gate, or how a neighbor's curtains twitched at an odd hour. This particular morning, however, brought news that stirred even Miss Marple's composed demeanor. Clara, her young maid, burst into the parlor with a tray of tea and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard?" she began, setting the tray down with a clatter. "It's Mr. Langston, the painter, gone, they say. Vanished from his studio, and they found a canvas covered in blood." Clara's eyes were wide, her voice trembling with the thrill of scandal. Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment, as she looked up with her clear, pale blue eyes. "Blood, Clara?" she asked mildly, though her mind was already turning over the implications. "Or perhaps something that merely resembles it. One mustn't jump to conclusions." Clara, undeterred, recounted the tale as she'd heard it, from the milkman, who had it from the baker's boy, who had been at the police station delivering rolls when the news broke. Victor Langston, the celebrated artist whose landscapes had graced galleries from London to Paris, had not been seen since the previous evening. His studio, a converted barn on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead, had been found locked from the inside, its single window latched. Inside, the police had discovered a canvas unlike any of Langston's serene works, a chaotic swirl of crimson, stark and unsettling, dominating the easel in the center of the room. The villagers, Clara said, were whispering of murder. Or perhaps something stranger still. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene, but her thoughts sharp as a pin. "A locked studio and a bloody canvas," she mused aloud, setting her cup down. "How very theatrical. One wonders if it was meant to be seen." She thanked Clara, who scurried off to spread the tale further, and resumed her knitting, though her mind was far from the pink wool in her hands. Victor Langston was no stranger to her. She had seen his paintings at a local exhibition, their vibrant greens and golds capturing the essence of the countryside with a skill that bordered on genius. But genius, she knew, often attracted envy, greed, or worse. By midday, Miss Marple decided to see the studio for herself. She donned her sensible coat and hat, picked up her walking stick more for effect than necessity, and made her way along the winding lane to the edge of the village. The studio stood apart, its weathered beams half hidden by ivy, a place that seemed to belong more to the wild than to the tidy order of St. Mary Mead. A small crowd had gathered, kept at bay by a young constable who looked harried under the weight of their curiosity. Miss Marple approached with her usual air of mild deference, which had a way of disarming even the most officious. "Good morning, Constable," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying that quiet authority that made people listen. "I wonder if Inspector Craddock is about. I've known him since he was a boy, you know, and I thought I might offer a word or two about this dreadful business." The constable, recognizing her as the village's unofficial arbiter of mysteries, hesitated, only a moment before waving her through. Inside the studio, Miss Marple found Inspector Craddock, his face lined with the strain of a case that promised to be anything but straightforward. The studio was a clutter of artistic chaos brushes, scattered on a table, jars of pigment gleaming in the light, and sketches pinned haphazardly to the walls. But all eyes were drawn to the easel, where the crimson canvas stood like a silent accusation. Miss Marple. Craddock greeted her, his tone a mix of respect and exasperation. "I might have known you'd turn up. What do you make of this?" Then he gestured to the canvas, its streaks of red paint vivid against the pale linen. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the work. The strokes were wild, almost violent, a stark contrast to Langston's usual precision. "Curious," she said softly. "It's not his style at all, is it? And yet, it was meant to be seen. A locked door, a latched window, someone wanted this to be the first thing found." Craddock frowned, running a hand through his hair. "We've no body, no blood except what's on that canvas, and the lab will tell us if it's paint or not. Langston's gone though, and his car's still here. No one saw him leave." Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, lingering on a smudged footprint near the door, too faint for the police to have noticed yet. "People," she said, almost to herself, "are rarely as careful as they think. Tell me, Inspector, who was closest to Mr. Langston?" Craddock sighed, pulling out his notebook. "4 of them, by all accounts. His apprentice, Timothy Renna, nervous sort, always trailing after Langston. His patron, Lady Beatrice Harrow, who's got more money than half the county and a taste for his paintings. His model, Elise Duval, a French girl who's been posing for him lately. And his dealer, Reginald Voss, who's been selling Langston's work for a fortune. All of them were seen near here last night." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sketching the outlines of their characters, as she might sketch a pattern for her knitting. "A varied cast," she murmured, "each with their own reasons to wish Mr. Langston, present or absent. I think, Inspector, I shall have to meet them." As she left the studio, the mist was lifting, revealing the rolling hills that Langston had so often painted. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. A canvas painted in crimson, a locked room, and 4 suspects with secrets of their own st. Mary Mead had not seen such a puzzle in years. She walked home slowly, her stick tapping the path, already certain that the truth, like the mist, would clear with time and a little careful observation. Chapter 2. The 4 Suspects. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaded windows of the St. Mary Mead Village Hall, casting a lattice of light across the polished wooden floor. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in a corner, her knitting bag at her feet, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, her gray hair tucked under a sensible hat, her eyes mild behind her spectacles. But those who knew her, Inspector Craddock among them, understood that her presence in the hall was no accident. She had requested to be present when Craddock interviewed the 4 individuals closest to Victor Langston, the vanished painter, and the inspector, with a mix of resignation and respect, had agreed. "She'll see things I miss," he had muttered to his sergeant, though he would never admit it aloud. The village hall, usually reserved for flower shows and parish meetings, had been transformed into a makeshift interview room. A long table stood at one end, where Craddock sat with his notebook and a stern expression. Beside him was Sergeant Mills, a young man with a penchant for taking notes in a laborious shorthand that Miss Marple found mildly amusing. The air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and the faint mustiness of old curtains, and a small crowd of villagers lingered outside, their murmurs audible through the open windows. News of Langston's disappearance and the crimson canvas had spread like wildfire, and St. Mary Mead was alive with speculation. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the 4 suspects, who sat in a row of chairs along the wall, each isolated in their own thoughts. They were an eclectic group, bound to Langston by ambition, admiration, or Everest, and she studied them with the same care she might give to a complex stitch in her knitting. There was Timothy Wren, the apprentice, a lanky youth of perhaps 20, his dark hair falling into his eyes, his fingers fidgeting with a pencil that he twirled like a baton. Lady Beatrice Harrow, the patron, sat ramrod straight, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her gloved hands clutching a handbag as if it were a shield. Elise Duval, the model, lounged with a studied nonchalance, her dark eyes darting about the room, her lips curved in a faint, enigmatic smile. And Reginald Voss, the dealer, exuded a polished confidence, his tailored suit immaculate, his smile a touch too smooth for Miss Marple's liking. Craddock cleared his throat, signaling the start of the proceedings. "We're here to establish the facts surrounding Victor Langston's disappearance," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Each of you was seen near his studio last night, and I'll need your accounts of your movements. Let's start with you, Mr. Wren." Timothy Wren started, the pencil slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, his face flushing as he stammered, "Me. Yes, sir, of course." His voice was high, nervous, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward the others, as if seeking rescue. "I was with Mr. Langston in the studio until about 9 o'clock. He was working on a new piece, not the one you found, mind you, something else, a landscape. He was in a strange mood, muttering about someone betraying him. I thought he meant the critics. You know how they'd been harsh lately." "Did he mention anyone specific?" Craddock asked, his pen poised. Timothy shook his head, his hair falling into his eyes again. "No, sir. He just said they. And betrayal. I tried to calm him, but he sent me off. Said he wanted to be alone. I locked the door behind me, as he always insisted, and went home to my lodgings at Mrs. Price's cottage." His voice wavered, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the slight tremor in his hands. Fear, she thought, or perhaps guilt, or both. Young men, in her experience, were often entangled in the schemes of others, their loyalty a fragile thing. Craddock made a note, then turned to Lady Beatrice Harrow, who rose with the dignity of a duchess summoned to court. "Lady Harrow," he said, "your account, please." Lady Beatrice's lips pursed, as if the very act of being questioned was an affront. "I am not accustomed to such proceedings, Inspector," she began, her voice crisp as autumn leaves. "But since you insist, I visited Victor's studio at around 7:30. I had commissioned a new painting view of my estate and wished to discuss its progress. He was distracted, I admit, but perfectly civil. I stayed perhaps 20 minutes, then returned to my car. My chauffeur, Jenkins, can confirm the time." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite interest. Lady Beatrice's account was precise, almost rehearsed, and yet there was a tightness in her voice, a hint of unease that belied her composure. "Did you notice anything unusual, Lady Harrow?" Miss Marple asked softly, her tone so gentle it might have been mistaken for idle curiosity. Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed, but she answered, "Only that Victor seemed preoccupied. He mentioned something about his work being undervalued, but I dismissed it as artistic temperament. I saw no canvas with that dreadful red paint, if that's what you mean." Her gloved fingers tightened on her handbag, and Miss Marple made a mental note of the gesture. Pride, she thought, could mask many things, including complicity. Next was Elise Duval, who rose with a grace that drew every eye in the room. Her dress, a simple but striking green, clung to her figure, and her dark hair was swept back to reveal a face that might have stepped from one of Langston's portraits. "Inspector," she said, her French accent softening the edges of her words, "I was with Victor until nearly midnight. I posed for him a new portrait, you understand. He was intense, as always, but not distressed. When I left, he was still at his easel, painting." She paused, her eyes flickering to the floor. I did not see that red canvas. It was not there when I left. Craddock leaned forward. Midnight is late. Miss Duval, can anyone confirm when you left the studio? Elise's smile was fleeting, almost secretive. The village was asleep. Inspector, I walked home alone to my rooms at the Blue Boar Inn, but I assure you, Victor was alive and well when I left him. Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faintest hesitation, as if Elise were choosing her words with care. A woman with secrets, she thought, and perhaps a heart too closely entwined with the painter's. Finally, Craddock turned to Reginald Voss, who stood with the ease of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Mr. Voss, Craddock said, you were seen near the studio at around 10. What were you doing there? Voss's smile was disarming, his teeth gleaming under the hall's lights. Merely a business call, Inspector. Victor and I had an appointment to discuss his next exhibition in London. I arrived at 10, found him in good spirits, and left by 10:30. He was very much alive, I assure you, and working on a sketch. Nothing unusual at all. His voice was smooth as polished marble, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes met Craddock's without flinching. Too smooth, she thought. A man so confident often had something to hide. Did you see the canvas with the red paint, Craddock? Pressed. Voss shook his head. No, Inspector. His easel held a half-finished landscape, as Timothy said. That garish thing you found must have come later. His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple's sharp ears caught a trace of unease, a crack in his polished facade. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. That's all for now, he said. But don't leave the village. We'll need to speak with you again. The suspects rose, each casting glances at the others, Timothy with nervousness, Beatrice with disdain, Elise with a guarded curiosity, and Voss with a smile that never reached his eyes. They filed out, leaving Miss Marple and Craddock alone with Sergeant Mills. Well, Miss Marple, Craddock said, rubbing his temples, what do you make of them? 4 stories, all plausible, but none quite adding up. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. People are rarely as straightforward as they seem, Inspector. Young Timothy is frightened, but whether of guilt or something else, I cannot yet say. Lady Beatrice is proud, and pride can blind one to inconvenient truths. Miss Duval has a charm that conceals as much as it reveals, and Mr. Voss, well, he is a man who plays his cards close to his chest. But there is one thing they all share. And what's that? Craddock asked, leaning forward. They all know more than they've told us, Miss Marple said simply. And that canvas, Inspector, it's the key. It was meant to be found, to shock, to mislead. Someone wanted us to think of blood, of violence. But why? Craddock sighed. You and your riddles, Miss Marple. I'll have the lab results on the paint by tomorrow. If it's not blood, we're dealing with a very strange game indeed. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving a pattern from the threads of the morning's interviews. She thought of her nephew Raymond's wife, Joan, an artist herself, who had once spoken of the passion and rivalry that simmered in the art world. A canvas, Joan had said, can hide as much as it reveals. Miss Marple had nodded then, just as she nodded now, for she knew that human nature, like a painting, had its layers, some bright, some dark, and some hidden, until the right light fell upon them, as she gathered her knitting bag and prepared to leave. She paused by the window, looking out at the village green, where the suspects had dispersed. Timothy was hurrying toward the inn, his head down. Lady Beatrice was climbing into her chauffeured car, her posture regal. Elise lingered by a lamppost, lighting a cigarette with a graceful flick of her wrist, and Voss stood by the hall's entrance, speaking quietly to a man in a dark coat. A stranger, Miss Marple noted, with a satchel slung over his shoulder. She filed the image away, like a skein of wool waiting to be unraveled. Inspector, she said softly, turning back to Craddock, I think I shall take a walk tomorrow, perhaps to the Blue Boar Inn. or to Mrs. Price's cottage. One hears such interesting things in passing. Craddock smiled, despite himself. You'll have me chasing shadows before this is done, Miss Marple. But if you hear anything, you'll let me know. Of course, she replied, her voice as gentle as ever. But as she stepped into the fading light of the afternoon, her mind was anything but gentle. For suspects, for stories, and a canvas painted in crimson, a puzzle as intricate as any she had ever faced. And Miss Marple, with her quiet ways and her sharp eyes, was determined to solve it. Chapter 3. The Bloody Canvas. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a sky heavy with clouds, as if the heavens themselves were brooding over the mystery of Victor Langston's disappearance. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the threat of rain, sat at her breakfast table, her toast and marmalade untouched, as she pondered the events of the previous day. The crimson canvas, with its wild, violent strokes, lingered in her mind like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody. She had seen many things in her long life: jealousy, greed, fear, but this canvas was something else entirely. A deliberate act meant to provoke, to mislead, or perhaps to warn. By 10 o'clock. She was at the police station, a modest brick building tucked behind the village post office. Inspector Craddock had telephoned her earlier, his voice clipped with the urgency of new information. The lab results are in, he had said, and I'd value your thoughts, Miss Marple. She arrived with her umbrella in hand, her sensible shoes tapping lightly on the pavement, and found Craddock in his office, surrounded by papers and a faint air of exasperation. Good morning, Inspector, she greeted, settling into a chair with the ease of one accustomed to making herself at home anywhere. You've had word about the canvas, I presume? Craddock nodded, pushing a typewritten report across the desk. It's paint, not blood. A mixture of vermilion and cadmium red, to be precise. No trace of anything organic. But the way it was applied, slashed, almost thrown onto the canvas, it's nothing like Langston's usual work. The lab chaps say it was done in a hurry, with a palette knife, not a brush. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest as she scanned the report. A palette knife, she murmured. How very expressive. And yet, Inspector, it was left where it could not be missed. Locked door, latched window, and that canvas on the easel, as if staged for an audience. Someone wanted us to see it and draw conclusions. Craddock leaned back, his brow furrowed. You're saying it's a distraction? But why go to such lengths? If Langston's been harmed or worse, why not just leave the body? Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, because there is no body. Or perhaps because the truth is more complicated than murder. She paused, her fingers smoothing the edge of her shawl. May I see the canvas again, Inspector? Sometimes, the smallest detail tells the loudest story. Craddock, accustomed to her cryptic ways, arranged for the canvas to be brought from evidence storage. It arrived in a protective cover, carried by Sergeant Mills, who set it carefully on a table. The crimson streaks were even more striking in the harsh light of the station, their jagged lines seeming to pulse with a strange energy. Miss Marple leaned closer, her spectacles catching the light as she examined the edges of the paint, the texture of the canvas, the faint smudges where fingers might have gripped it. Curious, she said at last, straightening up. The paint is thick, almost caked in places, but there's something beneath it, faint lines, as if another sketch was started and covered over. And here, she pointed to a corner, a smudge that looks like a fingerprint, but not quite clear enough to be certain. Have your men checked for prints? Inspector Craddock nodded. They're working on it, but the canvas is a mess, too many smudges to isolate a clear print. The studio itself was clean, oddly so. No clear fingerprints on the easel or the door, as if someone wiped them down. Miss Marple's lips pursed. A clean studio and a chaotic canvas. One suggests care, the other frenzy. It's almost as if two hands were at work or one hand playing two parts. She glanced at Craddock, her expression serene, but her mind racing. I wonder, Inspector, if you've considered the possibility that Mr. Langston himself painted this canvas. Craddock blinked, caught off guard. Langston? But why would he stage his own disappearance? He's got fame, money, patrons, everything an artist could want. Everything, Miss Marple said, except, perhaps, peace of mind. Artists, you know, are often troubled by their own success. They see enemies where there are none, or perhaps where there are too many. But you're right, it's a question of motive. And motive, I find, is always rooted in human nature. She stepped back from the canvas, her gaze lingering on its violent swirls. I think, she said, I should like to speak with Mrs. Bantry. She has a way of hearing things that don't reach the police station. And then, perhaps, a visit to the studio again. There's something about that place, something we've missed. Craddock sighed, a wry smile tugging at his lips. You'll have me turning over every stone in St. Mary Mead before this is done, Miss Marple. But go on, talk to Mrs. Bantry. I'll have Mills drive you to the studio later if you like. Miss Marple thanked him and left the station, her umbrella tapping a steady rhythm as she walked toward Gossington Hall, the home of her old friend Dolly Bantry. The clouds had parted, revealing patches of blue, and the village was stirring with its usual rhythm, children playing by the green, the postman making his rounds. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, circling the canvas and the four suspects, each with their own reasons to wish Langston gone or to wish him found. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry welcomed her with a cry of delight, ushering her into the drawing room where a fire crackled cheerfully. Jane, you sly thing, Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, pouring tea from a silver pot. I knew you'd be in the thick of this Langston business. It's all anyone can talk about, that ghastly canvas. They're saying it's blood. You know, though. I told Arthur it's probably just paint. What do you think? Miss Marple smiled, accepting her tea. Paint, Dolly, as the police have confirmed. But a very deliberate sort of paint, meant to shock. Tell me, what have you heard in the village? You always know the undercurrents. Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with the thrill of gossip. Oh, plenty, they say. Timothy Wren was mooning over Langston like a lost puppy, always in his shadow, poor boy. And Lady Beatrice, well, she's been throwing money at Langston for years, but I hear she's been cross with him lately. Something about a painting she didn't like. Elise Duval, that French girl, has the men in the village all aflutter. But there's talk she and Langston were more than just artist and model, and Voss such a charmer. But Mrs. Price at the inn says he's been asking questions about finances, poking about like he's after something. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind cataloging each detail. And the stranger in the dark coat? She asked, recalling the man she had seen with Voss. Has anyone mentioned him? Mrs. Bantry's brows rose. You don't miss a thing, do you? Yes, old Mr. Giles at the shop saw a man like that near the studio 2 nights ago, carrying a satchel. Said he looked out of place, not a local. I thought it might be one of those art collectors, you know, always sniffing about for a bargain. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to Voss and his polished smile. A satchel could hold many things, papers, money, or perhaps something more incriminating. Thank you, Dolly, she said, setting her cup down. You've been most helpful, as always. By early afternoon, Miss Marple was back at Langston's studio, accompanied by Sergeant Mills, who looked faintly bemused at being her escort. The barn was as she remembered it, its ivy-covered walls giving it an air of secrecy. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of turpentine and dust. The easel stood empty now, the crimson canvas in police custody. But Miss Marple's eyes roamed the room, seeking what others had overlooked. She paused by a workbench cluttered with brushes and jars, her gaze settling on a small, overturned tin of vermilion paint. It was nearly empty, its rim crusted with dried pigment, "Sergeant," she said, "did your men note this tin?" Mills glanced at it, shrugging. "We catalogued everything, ma'am. Just paint, isn't it?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "But it's the same shade as our canvas, I think. And look, there's a smear on the floor beneath it, as if someone knocked it over in haste." She knelt, her joints protesting, and peered at the smear. It was faint, but distinct, and beside it was a partial footprint, too small to belong to Langston, who was a tall man. "A woman's shoe, perhaps," she murmured, "or a small man's." "Curious." Mills, catching her tone, made a note. "I'll have the lads check it, Miss Marple. Anything else?" She rose, her eyes scanning the walls, the sketches pinned, haphazardly, the shelves of art supplies. "Not yet, Sergeant. But I think this studio has more to tell us. A place like this, it holds the artist's secrets, even when he's gone." As they left, the clouds were gathering again, and Miss Marple felt a chill that had little to do with the weather. The canvas, the studio, the suspects, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was beginning to see the shape of it. But it was a shape that required patience, observation, and a keen understanding of the human heart. She thought of her old friend, Sir Henry Clithering, who had once said, "You see people, Jane, as they really are." And so she did, layer by layer, like a painting stripped to its underdrawing. "Back to the station, ma'am?" Mills asked, opening the car door. "No, Sergeant," Miss Marple replied, her smile faint but resolute. "To the Blue Boar Inn, if you please. I think it's time I had a word with Miss Duval." Chapter 4. The Apprentice's Tale. The Blue Boar Inn, a quaint establishment with low beams and a perpetually smoky hearth, was unusually quiet as Miss Jane Marple stepped inside, her umbrella dripping from a sudden drizzle. The inn's parlor, with its chintz curtains and worn armchairs, was a favorite haunt of St. Mary Mead's gossips, but today the regulars were subdued, their whispers hushed by the weight of Victor Langston's disappearance. Miss Marple, her hat slightly askew from the wind, scanned the room for Elise Duval, but the French model was nowhere to be seen. Instead, her attention was drawn to a familiar figure hunched over a pint in the corner. Timothy Wren, Langston's apprentice, his thin shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible burden. Miss Marple approached with her usual unassuming air, her smile as gentle as a spring breeze. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wren," she said, settling into a chair opposite him without waiting for an invitation. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I thought we might have a little chat about Mr. Langston." Timothy started, his pint glass clinking against the table as he looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and apprehension. "Miss Marple," he stammered, pushing a lock of dark hair from his forehead. I've already told the inspector everything. I don't know what else I can say." "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly, her knitting bag resting at her feet like a faithful companion. "But sometimes, you know, a young man like yourself might remember something new when speaking to someone less official. I've always found that a cup of tea and a quiet talk can bring things to light." She signaled to the innkeeper for tea, her manner so disarming that Timothy seemed to relax, if only slightly. The tea arrived, steaming in a chipped pot, and Miss Marple poured with the precision of long practice, offering Timothy a cup he accepted with trembling hands. "Now," she said, her voice soft but probing, "you were with Mr. Langston the night he vanished, helping him in the studio. He was upset, you said, about betrayal. Can you recall exactly what he said? Even the smallest word might help." Timothy stared into his tea, his fingers tightening around the cup. He was pacing, muttering to himself. He began, his voice low. "I was mixing pigments ultramarine and ochre for a sky he was working on. He kept saying things like, 'They think they can fool me, and it's all a lie.' I asked him what was wrong, but he just waved me off, said I wouldn't understand. He was different that night, not like himself. Usually, He'd talk about art, technique, light things that made him light up. But that night, he was angry, almost afraid. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained kind. Afraid, Mr. Wren. That's a strong word. Did he mention anyone by name, a person he thought was betraying him? Timothy hesitated, his gaze flickering to the window where rain streaked the glass. Not exactly, he said at last, but he did say something about the one who sells my soul. I thought he meant the critics. You know, how they'd been harsh about his last exhibition. Or maybe Mr. Voss, his dealer. He's always pushing for more paintings, faster. But I didn't ask. I just wanted to finish the pigments and get out. He told me to lock the door when I left, so I did. That was about 9 o'clock. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the phrase, the one who sells my soul. It was poetic, almost theatrical, but then, artists often were. She thought of her nephew Raymond's wife, Joan, whose own artistic temperament flared in moments of passion or frustration. And the canvas, Mr. Wren, she continued, the one with the red paint. Did you see it in the studio that night? Timothy shook his head vigorously, his hair falling into his eyes again. No, ma'am. There was a landscape on the easel, half finished, with blues and greens. Nothing red, nothing like that thing they found. I swear it. His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the desperation in it, the way his hands clenched as if to hold himself together. You're very loyal to Mr. Langston, she said gently. He must have been a good teacher, to inspire such devotion. Timothy's flush deepened, and he looked away. He he saw something in me, said I had talent. He promised me an exhibition of my own, one day, if I kept at it. Nobody else ever believed in me like that. His voice softened, and for a moment, he seemed younger, a boy clinging to a mentor's approval. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over his words. Loyalty could be a powerful motive, but so could resentment, or fear of losing a mentor's favor. She recalled a young gardener in St. Mary Mead, years ago, who had stolen from his employer out of a misguided sense of entitlement, believing he was owed more than he'd been given. Timothy's devotion to Langston was genuine, but devotion, she knew, could curdle into something darker. Did you ever see Mr. Langston argue with anyone? She asked, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. Mr. Voss, perhaps, or Miss Duval, or even Lady Harrow. Timothy's eyes darted to the side, a telltale sign of unease. Not argue, exactly, he said slowly. But Mr. Voss was always around, pushing for more paintings. Mr. Langston didn't like it, said Voss cared more about money than art. And Miss Duval, she and Mr. Langston were close, you know. Sometimes I'd hear them talking late, laughing, but other times, she'd leave the studio looking upset. I don't know why. As for Lady Harrow, she came by now and then, always acting like she owned the place. Mr. Langston didn't like that either, but he needed her money. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag, more for comfort than necessity. And this stranger people have mentioned, she said, her voice almost a murmur, the man in the dark coat with the satchel. Did you ever see him near the studio? Timothy's cup rattled against its saucer, and he set it down quickly. A man in a dark coat, he repeated, his voice a shade too high. I don't think so. There were always people coming and going, collectors, delivery men. I didn't pay much attention, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with a nervousness that Miss Marple tucked away for later consideration. She smiled, her expression as warm as ever. You've been very helpful, Mr. Wren. It's a trying time, I know. But the truth has a way of coming to light, like a painting, taking shape on a canvas. She rose, gathering her bag, and left Timothy staring into his pint, his face pale and troubled. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick and gleaming. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the village green, her mind sifting through Timothy's words. His fear was palpable, but whether it stemmed from guilt, loyalty, or something else, she could not yet say. The phrase, "the one who sells my soul," echoed in her thoughts, pointing, perhaps, to Reginald Voss, whose polished charm she distrusted. But Timothy's hesitation about the stranger in the dark coat suggested another thread in the tapestry, one that might lead to answers or two more questions. She decided to visit Mrs. Price's cottage, where Timothy lodged, hoping to glean more from the landlady's sharp tongue. Mrs. Price was a woman of robust opinions, and Miss Marple knew that a landlady's observations of her tenants could be as revealing as a detective's report. As she walked, she passed the church, where the vicar was tending the roses, and she paused to exchange pleasantries, her mind never straying far from the puzzle. At Mrs. Price's cottage, a tidy affair with geraniums in the window boxes, Miss Marple was welcomed with a cup of strong tea and a flood of gossip. "That Timothy Wren," Mrs. Price said, her hands planted on her hips, "always coming in late, tracking paint on my clean floors. Devoted to Mr. Langston, he was, but I heard him muttering once about being taken for granted. And last week, I saw him talking to that Mr. Voss outside the studio. Looked like a proper row, though they hushed up when they saw me." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "A row, Mrs. Price. Did you hear what they said?" "Not much," Mrs. Price admitted, "but Mr. Voss said something about keeping to the plan, and Timothy looked like he'd been slapped. I didn't think much of it at the time, artists and their tempers, you know, but now, with Mr. Langston gone." She trailed off, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her thoughts swirling like the crimson paint on Langston's canvas. Timothy's loyalty, Voss's influence, the stranger in the dark coat was a pattern, incomplete but forming. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a young man had been drawn into theft by a charismatic employer, his loyalty twisted into complicity. Timothy, she suspected, might be caught in a similar web, but whether as victim or accomplice, she could not yet determine. As she returned to her cottage, the evening sky was clearing, the stars just beginning to pierce the dusk. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap, and thought of the canvas, the studio, and the frightened young man at the inn. A betrayal, she murmured to herself, but whose, and to what end? The answer, she knew, lay not in the paint, but in the hearts of those who wielded it. Chapter 5. The patrons' pride. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Harrow Manor, a grand Georgian pile that stood like a sentinel over St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, walked up the gravel drive with the measured step of one who knew the value of appearances. She had received a note from Lady Beatrice Harrow, delivered by a liveried footman, inviting her to tea to discuss this unfortunate business with Victor Langston. The invitation, written in Beatrice's precise hand, was as much a summons as a courtesy, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the nuances of human behavior, sensed an opportunity to peer beneath the surface of the patron's polished exterior. The manor's oak-paneled hall gleamed with the patina of old wealth, its walls adorned with paintings, many of them Langston's, their vibrant landscapes glowing like windows to another world. A maid ushered Miss Marple into the drawing room, where Lady Beatrice sat enthroned in a high-backed chair, her silver hair gleaming under a chandelier. She wore a dove-gray dress, its severity softened by a string of pearls, and her posture was as erect as if she were posing for one of Langston's portraits. "Miss Marple," she said, rising with a smile that was more formal than warm, "how kind of you to come. I trust you'll take tea." "Thank you, Lady Harrow," Miss Marple replied, settling into a plush chair with her usual air of mild deference. "It's most gracious of you to invite me. I confess, I've been quite troubled by Mr. Langston's disappearance." Beatrice's lips tightened, a fleeting crack in her composure. As have we all, she said, pouring tea from a silver pot with a hand that betrayed no tremor. Victor was a genius, a true artist, though not without his eccentricities. I fear he may have wandered off in one of his moods. Artists, you understand, are prone to such flights. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to a Langston painting above the mantel, a sweeping view of the downs, its greens and golds almost luminous. A remarkable talent, she agreed. You've been a great supporter of his work, I gather. These paintings must be a source of pride. Beatrice's expression softened, a flicker of satisfaction crossing her face. Indeed, I discovered Victor years ago, when he was painting in obscurity. I funded his first exhibition, provided him with the studio here in St. Mary Mead. Without my patronage, he would not be the name he is today. Her voice held a note of possessiveness, as if Langston's genius were a trophy she had claimed. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers smoothing the edge of her shawl. How generous, she said, though I imagine it must be trying at times, supporting an artist's temperament. Did Mr. Langston ever seem discontent with your arrangement? Beatrice's hand paused, the teacup halfway to her lips. Discontent? Not at all. He was grateful, as he should be. Though I will admit, he could be difficult. Lately, he was preoccupied, muttering about his work being misused. I told him it was nonsense. His paintings were selling for thousands, thanks to Mr. Voss's efforts. But Victor was stubborn, always fretting over details. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. Misused, she repeated, softly. An interesting choice of word. Did he elaborate? Beatrice set her cup down with a faint clink. Not really. He was vague, as artists often are. I assumed he was upset about a review, or some trivial slight. He mentioned Mr. Voss, once, saying he was pushing too hard for new works. I told him it was the price of success, but he didn't seem convinced. Her tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in her eyes, as if the memory troubled her more than she cared to admit. The conversation drifted to village matters, the upcoming flower show, the vicar's new sermon series, but Miss Marple steered it back with the skill of a seasoned navigator. I understand you visited the studio the evening Mr. Langston vanished, she said, her voice as gentle as a breeze. Did you notice anything unusual? The canvas with the red paint, perhaps? Beatrice's lips pursed, and she adjusted her pearls with a deliberate gesture. That dreadful thing. No, it wasn't there when I visited at 7:30. Victor was working on a landscape, as usual. I spoke with him about a new commission, a portrait of my late husband's estate. He was distracted, barely listening, but that was nothing new. I left after 20 minutes, and my chauffeur drove me home. Jenkins will confirm it. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the details. Beatrice's account was consistent with what she had told Craddock, but its very precision raised a question. People, in her experience, often rehearsed their stories when they had something to hide or when they feared being caught in a lie. She thought of a neighbor in St. Mary Mead, years ago, who had recounted her day with such exactness that it betrayed her involvement in a petty theft. Pride, Miss Marple knew, could be as blinding as greed. And Mr. Voss, she ventured, her tone conversational, you mentioned his efforts in selling Mr. Langston's work. Were you pleased with his handling of the sales? Beatrice's expression hardened, a shadow crossing her face. Mr. Voss is efficient, she said carefully. He has a knack for finding buyers, though I sometimes wonder if his enthusiasm outstrips his judgment. Victor complained about him. Said he was selling paintings too quickly, to collectors who didn't appreciate them. I told him it was business, not sentiment, but Victor was never practical. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Artists rarely are, she said, but it's curious, isn't it, how money can complicate things. I recall a case in the village, years ago, where a gentleman invested heavily in a friend's venture, only to find the friend had been less than honest. Pride, you see, kept him from questioning too closely. Beatrice's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, offering only a tight smile as she poured more tea. Miss Marple, sensing the limits of her probing, shifted to safer ground, complimenting the manor's gardens and inquiring about Beatrice's plans for the season. But her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the fragments of the conversation. Beatrice's pride in her role as Langston's patron was evident. But so was her defensiveness about Voss. Had she suspected something amiss in the dealer's dealings? Or was her unease rooted in something closer to home? As the visit drew to a close, Beatrice escorted Miss Marple to the hall, her manner courteous but distant. "I trust you'll keep me informed, Miss Marple," she said, her voice cool. "Victor's disappearance is a loss to us all, but I'm sure the police will find him soon." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her smile as serene as ever, "and thank you for the tea. It's been most enlightening." She stepped into the drive, where Jenkins, the chauffeur, was polishing the car. A burly man with a weathered face, he nodded politely as Miss Marple approached. "Good afternoon, Jenkins," she said, pausing beside him. "You drove Lady Harrow home from Mr. Langston's studio the night he vanished, I believe." Jenkins straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Yes, ma'am. Picked her up at 10 to 8, sharp." "She was in a bit of a mood, said Mr. Langston was being difficult. We were back at the manor by 8. Miss Marple nodded, noting the exactness of his timing. "And did you see anyone else near the studio? A man in a dark coat, perhaps, with a satchel?" Jenkins frowned, his brow creasing. "Can't say I did, ma'am. It was getting dark, and I was focused on the road. But there was a car parked near the lane, a black one, not local. Didn't think much of it at the time." Miss Marple thanked him and walked back to the village, her umbrella tapping the gravel. A black car, a stranger in a dark coat, and be it guarded answers each was a thread in the tapestry of Langston's disappearance. She thought of Voss, whose name kept surfacing like a shadow, and of Beatrice's pride, which might have blinded her to his schemes. Or perhaps, she mused, Beatrice knew more than she let on, her patronage a facade for deeper entanglements. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap. The afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating the Langston painting she had seen at the manor, its colors vivid in her memory. Pride, she thought, was a dangerous thing. It could make one overlook a betrayal, or commit one. As she picked up her needles, she resolved to speak with Elise Duval next. The model's charm, she suspected, hid secrets as deep as Beatrice's pride, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover them. Chapter 6. The Model's Mystery. The village of St. Mary Mead was bathed in the soft light of late afternoon, its cottages glowing like embers against the gathering dusk. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag swinging gently at her side, made her way to the Blue Boar Inn, where Elise Duval was known to take her coffee at this hour. The inn's garden, with its riot of roses and lavender, was a favorite spot for the French model, who had a knack for turning even the simplest setting into a stage. Miss Marple, ever observant, had noted Elisa's penchant for drama during their brief encounter at the village hall, and she suspected the young woman's charm was a veil for secrets that might illuminate Victor Langston's disappearance. The inn's garden was quiet, save for the hum of bees and the distant clink of teacups from the parlor. Elise sat at a wrought-iron table, a sketchbook open before her, her pencil moving with quick, graceful strokes. Her dark hair was swept into a loose knot, and her green dress caught the light, making her seem part of the garden's own palette. As Miss Marple approached, Elise looked up, her dark eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Miss Marple," she said, her French accent softening the edges of her words. "What a pleasure. Will you join me?" She gestured to the chair opposite, her smile as inviting as it was guarded. "Thank you, Miss Duval," Miss Marple replied, settling into the chair with her usual air of quiet deference. I was hoping for a word about Mr. Langston. This business with the studio, it's quite unsettling, don't you think? Elisa's smile faltered, and she closed her sketchbook with a deliberate snap. Unsettling, yes, she said. Victor is a brilliant man. I cannot believe he would simply vanish. But the police, they ask so many questions, and I have told them all I know. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, noted the faint smudge of crimson paint on Elisa's fingers, a detail that echoed the canvas in Langston's studio. Of course, she said gently, but sometimes, in talking to a friend or someone outside the police, one remembers a detail that seemed unimportant at the time. You were with Mr. Langston late that night, I believe, posing for a portrait. Elise nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her sketchbook. Until nearly midnight, she said. Victor was painting, as always. He was intense, focused, but not distressed. We talked, we laughed a little. He was alive when I left, Miss Marple, I swear it. Her voice held a note of urgency, as if she feared being doubted. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of kindly interest. And the canvas with the red paint. You didn't see it on the easel. No, Elise said quickly, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's for a moment before darting away. There was a portrait, my portrait, half finished. No red paint, no chaos. That canvas, it appeared after I left. Her fingers tightened on the sketchbook, and Miss Marple noted the tension, like a string pulled taut. Forgive me, my dear, Miss Marple said, her tone as soft as a lullaby, but I couldn't help noticing the paint on your fingers. Crimson, isn't it? Much like the shade in the studio? Elisa's hand froze, and she glanced at her fingers, a faint flush rising to her cheeks. Oh, this, she said, forcing a laugh. I was sketching earlier, experimenting with colors. Victor taught me to mix pigments, you know. I must have been careless. She rubbed her fingers together, as if to erase the evidence, but the smudge remained. Miss Marple nodded, her smile unchanging. How interesting, she said. Mr. Langston must have been a fine teacher. You were close to him, I gather a model, and perhaps a friend. Elisa's eyes softened, a flicker of something sorrow, perhaps, or regret crossing her face. Yes, she admitted. Victor was special. He saw beauty in everything, even in me, when I felt I had none. We were friends, yes, and maybe more, for a time. But it was not what people think. It was about art, about creating something true. Her voice trembled, and she looked away, her gaze fixed on the roses, as if seeking solace in their petals. Miss Marple's mind turned over. The words, recalling a young woman in St. Mary Mead, who had loved a man too deeply, her devotion blinding her to his flaws. Love, she said softly, can be a complicated thing. Did Mr. Langston ever speak of troubles with his work, perhaps, or with others? Mr. Voss, for instance, or Lady Harrow? Elisa's lips parted, then closed, as if weighing her words. Victor did not like Mr. Voss, she said at last. He said Voss cared only for profit, not for the soul of the work. They argued sometimes, about prices, about which paintings to sell. Victor wanted to keep some pieces, but Voss insisted they go to collectors. As for Lady Harrow, she was demanding. Victor felt she owned him, not just his paintings. He told me once she made him feel like a pet, not an artist. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew her knitting from her bag, more for the comfort of routine than necessity. And young Timothy Wren, she asked. Did Mr. Langston ever mention him? Elisa's expression darkened, a shadow passing over her features. Timothy was always there, following Victor like a shadow. Victor was kind to him, taught him, but I think Timothy wanted more recognition, perhaps, or something else. I saw him watching us sometimes, when I posed. His eyes, they were hungry, but not for art. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Elise. noting the mix of candor and caution in her words. The model's affection for Langston seemed genuine, but the crimson smudge on her fingers, the quickness of her denial about the canvas, these were threads that did not yet align. She thought of a case long ago, when a young woman's love for a man had led her to conceal his crimes, believing she was protecting him. Was Elise hiding something similar, or was her secrecy born of fear? And this stranger, Miss Marple, said, her voice almost a murmur, the man in the dark coat with a satchel, seen near the studio. Did you ever notice him? Elise's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed caught off guard. A man in a dark coat? She repeated, her accent thickening slightly. No, I don't think so. The village is full of strangers, sometimes collectors, visitors. I didn't pay attention. But her fingers tightened on the sketchbook, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, like a card player guarding her hand. You've been very kind to talk with me, Miss Marple said, rising with a smile. I shan't keep you from your sketching. It's a lovely talent. You know, I've always admired those who can capture life on paper. Elise returned the smile, though it was strained. Thank you, Miss Marple. I hope Victor is found soon. Her voice was soft, almost a plea, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the young woman, caught in a web she did not fully understand as she left the garden. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth. Miss Marple walked slowly toward her cottage, her mind sifting through Elise's words. The model's affection for Langston was clear, but so was her evasiveness about the crimson paint and the stranger. The smudge on her fingers was a small thing, yet Miss Marple knew that small things overlooked details. Careless gestures often unraveled the tightest knots. She recalled a village scandal, years ago, when a young woman's lipstick on a glass had betrayed her presence at a crime scene. Paint, she thought, was not so different. At her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap, the familiar rhythm of the needles soothing her thoughts. She considered the suspects: Timothy's fear, Beatrice's pride, Elise's secrets, and Voss's polished charm. Each had a connection to Langston, a motive that flickered like a candle in the dark. But the canvas, with its violent crimson strokes, was the key, a message meant to mislead or to accuse. And Elise, with her painted fingers and guarded eyes, was a piece of the puzzle that did not yet fit. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, she would visit London, where Reginald Voss kept his offices. The dealer's name had surfaced too often, his shadow too long, to be ignored. She thought of her old friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had once said, "You see through people, Jane, like glass." And so she did, but the glass was clouded, and she needed to wipe it clean. With a final click of her needles, she set her knitting aside and gazed out at the starlit village, certain that the truth, like a hidden sketch beneath a canvas, was waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 7. The dealer's game. The train to London rattled through the countryside, its rhythm a counterpoint to Miss Jane Marple's thoughts as she gazed out the window at the passing fields. Her black handbag rested on her lap, her knitting tucked inside, though her fingers remained still, her mind too occupied with the puzzle of Victor Langston's disappearance. She had decided to visit Reginald Voss's office in the city, a decision prompted by the threads of suspicion that wove through every conversation: Timothy's nervousness, Beatrice's pride, Elise's guarded charm. Voss, with his polished smile and evasive answers, was a figure who loomed large in the mystery, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, sensed he held a key to the truth. The offices of Voss & Co. were in a smart Georgian building off Bond Street, its facade all elegance and discretion, much like the man himself. Miss Marple, her sensible coat and hat a stark contrast to the sleek passers-by, was shown into a waiting room adorned with paintings, none of them Langston's, she noted, but lesser works by artists, whose names she vaguely recalled from her nephew Raymond's art magazines. A secretary, crisp and efficient, ushered her into Voss's office, where the dealer rose from behind a mahogany desk, his smile as smooth as ever. "Miss Marple," he said, extending a hand, "what an unexpected pleasure. I trust you're here about poor Victor. A dreadful business." His voice was warm, but his eyes were sharp, assessing her as one might a rival at an auction. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Voss," Miss Marple replied, settling into a leather chair with her usual air of mild deference. "I've been trying to understand Mr. Langston's disappearance, and as his dealer, you must know so much about his world. I thought you might shed some light." Voss leaned back, his fingers steepled. "His suit impeccable, of course," he said. "Victor was a genius, but a difficult one. Temperamental, as artists often are. I saw him the night he vanished, around 10, to discuss his next exhibition. He was in good spirits, working on a sketch. I left him at 10:30, and that was that." His tone was practiced, almost too perfect, and Miss Marple's keen ears caught the faintest note of rehearsal. She nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "And the canvas with the red paint. You didn't see it in the studio." Voss's smile didn't waver, but his eyes flickered. "No, nothing like that. Just his usual work, a landscape, I think. That red monstrosity must have appeared after I left. Quite unlike him, you know. Victor was all about precision, beauty." He gestured to a stack of ledgers on his desk. "His paintings fetch thousands now, thanks to my efforts. He had no reason to stage such a theatrical display." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the ledgers, noting their pristine order. "How fortunate for him to have such a capable dealer," she said, "though I understand he was sometimes troubled by the pace of your sales." "Did he ever express concerns about his work being misused?" Voss's smile tightened, a crack in his polished facade. "Misused?" Victor was prone to dramatic notions. He grumbled about sales, yes, wanted to keep some paintings for himself, as if they were his children. I told him it was business, not sentiment. Collectors don't wait, Miss Marple. They want the next masterpiece, and I ensure they get it." His voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, a hint of defensiveness that Miss Marple tucked away for later. She shifted slightly, her handbag resting on her knees. "I noticed a painting on your wall, a Langston, I presume, sold recently. To a collector?" She gestured vaguely toward the waiting room, though she had seen no such painting there. Voss hesitated just for a moment. "You're mistaken, I'm afraid. I keep no Langstons here too valuable. But I did sell one last month, a coastal scene, to a gentleman in Paris. The signature was perfect, the provenance impeccable." He leaned forward, his smile returning. "You have an eye for art, Miss Marple." "Oh, hardly," she said, with a self-deprecating smile. "But I do notice details. Signatures, for instance. They can be so revealing, don't you think?" Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, and she saw Voss's fingers twitch, as if suppressing an urge to fidget. "Indeed," he said, recovering quickly. Victor's signature was distinctive, a bold flourish. No one could mimic it, but his words came too quickly, and Miss Marple's mind seized on the discrepancy she had spotted in the village hall, painting with a signature slightly off, as if traced. She said nothing, letting the silence stretch, a technique she had learned long ago in St. Mary Mead, where silence often coaxed out truths. Voss filled the pause, as she had hoped. "You must understand, Miss Marple, the art world is a complex place. Collectors, critics, rivals. It's a game of trust and ambition. Victor played it well, but he was naive about certain realities. I protected him, ensured his work reached the right hands." "Protected," Miss Marple repeated softly. "A generous word. Though I wonder if Mr. Langston felt protected, or perhaps confined." She thought of a village merchant, years ago, who had protected his partner by controlling his finances, only to be caught siphoning funds. Control, she knew, could wear many masks. Voss's smile faltered, but he recovered with a laugh. Confined? Hardly. Victor had every freedom, thanks to me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a client waiting. He rose, signaling the end of the interview, but Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the desk. Those ledgers, she said, almost as an afterthought. They must be a treasure trove of information. Sales, collectors, perhaps even visitors to Mr. Langston's studio. I heard of a man in a dark coat, with a satchel, seen nearby. A courier, perhaps, for your business. Voss's face remained impassive, but his hand tightened on the desk's edge. A courier, possibly. I use several for deliveries, papers, sketches, that sort of thing. But I don't recall anyone specific that night. His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight stiffening of his shoulders, the mark of a man guarding a secret. She rose, her smile as serene as ever. Thank you, Mr. Voss. You've been most helpful. I shan't keep you from your client. As she left the office, she glanced back, catching Voss watching her with an intensity that belied his charm. Outside, the London air was thick with the scent of exhaust and wet pavement, a stark contrast to St. Mary Mead's freshness. Miss Marple made her way to a nearby tea shop, where she sat with a pot of Earl Grey, her mind sifting through the encounter. Voss's confidence was a carefully crafted mask, but she had seen the cracks, his unease at the mention of the signature, his guarded response about the courier. The ledgers, too, intrigued her. They held the financial threads of Langston's career, and perhaps the motive for his disappearance. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, when a shopkeeper's meticulous books had revealed a pattern of fraud, hidden in plain sight. Voss, she suspected, was playing a similar game, but with higher stakes. As she sipped her tea, she considered the stranger in the dark coat, mentioned by Mrs. Bantry and Jenkins. A courier, Voss had said, but his hesitation suggested more. Was this man a link to the crimson canvas, or to Langston himself? Miss Marple thought of Elise's painted fingers, Timothy's fear, Beatrice's pride, all circling Voss, whose ambition seemed to cast a long shadow. She decided to telephone Inspector Craddock from the station, before returning to St. Mary Mead. "Inspector," she said when he answered, her voice calm but firm, "I think you might look into Mr. Voss's ledgers, if you can, and perhaps inquire about a courier, a man in a dark coat, with a satchel. He may be more important than we thought." Craddock's sigh was audible through the line. "You've been stirring things up in London, haven't you, Miss Marple? I'll see what I can do. Anything else?" "Not yet," she said, her lips curving in a faint smile. "But I think Mr. Voss is playing a game, Inspector, and it's one he believes he's winning. We shall see." As the train carried her back to the village, Miss Marple gazed out at the darkening landscape, her mind weaving the threads of the case. Voss's charm, like the crimson canvas, was a distraction meant to obscure the truth. But truth, she knew, was like a stubborn stitch. It always surfaced, given time and care. She would watch, and listen, and wait, for the dealer's game was far from over. Chapter 8. A Village Whisper. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a chill, as if the village itself were holding its breath over the mystery of Victor Langston's disappearance. Miss Jane Marple, back from her London visit, sat in her cozy parlor, the fire casting a warm glow over her knitting, which lay untouched in her lap. Her conversation with Reginald Voss had left her with a sense of unease, his polished charm, a veneer that concealed something sharper, more calculating. But it was the whisper of the stranger in the dark coat, mentioned by Mrs. Bantry and glimpsed by Jenkins, that now occupied her thoughts. The village, she knew, was a place where secrets rarely stayed hidden, and she resolved to seek out its whispers to unravel the thread of this elusive figure. The next morning, Miss Marple set out for the village shop, a hub of gossip as reliable as the church clock. The shop, run by old Mr. Giles, was a cluttered treasure trove of tinned goods, newspapers, and the latest village talk. As she entered, the bell above the door jingled, and Mr. Giles looked up from his counter, his spectacles perched precariously on his nose. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his voice creaky as the floorboards. "Come about that painter, I reckon. Whole village is buzzing." Miss Marple smiled, selecting a tin of biscuits with deliberate care. "It is a troubling matter, Mr. Giles," she said. "I was wondering if you'd seen anything unusual, say, a stranger about the village, perhaps near Mr. Langston's studio. A man in a dark coat, carrying a satchel." Mr. Giles's eyes lit up, the prospect of sharing news as enticing as a sale. I did see such a man, 2 nights before the painter vanished. Standing by the lane near the studio, he was, looking, shifty-like. Dark coat, hat pulled low, and a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. I thought he might be one of them art buyers, but he didn't come into the shop, just lingered, and then was gone. Next day, I saw him talking to that Mr. Voss outside the Blue Boar, all hushed and serious. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the tin, her mind seizing on the detail. "Talking to Mr. Voss, you say? How interesting. Did you overhear anything?" Mr. Giles shook his head, his whiskers twitching with regret. "Not a word, Miss Marple. They clammed up when they saw me pass, but I'll tell you, that man didn't look like he belonged here. Too sharp, too city-like. Reminded me of a fellow who came through years ago, selling dodgy insurance. Turned out he was up to no good." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. She paid for the biscuits, tucking them into her handbag, and left the shop with a polite farewell. The stranger, now linked to Voss, was no mere courier, she suspected. His presence near the studio, his secretive meeting with the dealer, these were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a scheme larger than a simple disappearance. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, when a stranger's visits had heralded a series of thefts, his anonymity a cloak for deceit. This man, with his satchel and dark coat, felt like a similar harbinger. Her next stop was the vicarage, where the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, was known for her keen eye and sharper tongue. Miss Marple found her in the garden, pruning roses with a vigor that suggested she was working off some private irritation. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement exclaimed, brushing dirt from her gloves. "I suppose you're here about Langston? The village is positively feverish with theories, murder, madness, even a secret lover." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "Theories do abound, Mrs. Clement, but I'm more interested in facts. Have you heard anything about a stranger in the village, a man in a dark coat, perhaps, seen near the studio?" Mrs. Clement's eyes narrowed, her pruning shears pausing mid-snip. "Now that you mention it, yes. Young Billy, the butcher's boy, said he saw a man like that last week, near the studio at dusk. Carrying a satchel, he was, and looking about as if he didn't want to be seen. Billy thought he might be a poacher, but I wonder now. With all this talk of that red canvas, it makes one think." Miss Marple's mind catalogued the detail, another thread in the tapestry. "And did Billy see where this man went?" she asked, her voice as gentle as the breeze stirring the roses. "He lost sight of him near the lane," Mrs. Clement said, "but he mentioned a car, a black one, parked just out of view. Not one of the locals, he was sure. I told him to tell the police, but you know boys too busy with their own mischief." Miss Marple thanked her and continued her walk, her umbrella tapping the path as she pieced together the whispers. The stranger, the black car, the meeting with Voss, these were not random occurrences but part of a pattern, like the stitches in her knitting, each one essential to the whole. She decided to visit Mrs. Bantry again, hoping her friend's knack for gossip might yield more about this elusive figure. At Gossington Hall, Mrs. Bantry welcomed her with a tray of scones and a flood of chatter. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said, pouring tea. "I knew you'd be after this Langston business like a terrier. Have you found anything?" "They're saying that canvas was painted in blood, though I told Arthur it's nonsense. It's paint, Dolly, Miss Marple said, accepting a scone. But a very deliberate paint, meant to tell a story or to hide one. I'm curious about a stranger seen in the village. A man in a dark coat with a satchel. Mr. Giles mentioned him, and Mrs. Clement too. You spoke of him before. Have you heard anything new? Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, her scone halfway to her mouth. Oh, yes. I forgot to tell you Mrs. Price, Timothy's landlady, saw that man again, the night Langston vanished. She was out walking her dog, and there he was, near the studio, looking all furtive. She said he had a scar on his cheek, quite distinctive. And here's the juicy bitchy. Saw him hand something to Mr. Voss the next day, a packet of some sort, outside the inn. She couldn't see what it was, but Voss looked pleased as punch. Miss Marple's needles, drawn from her bag, clicked. Softly as she listened, a scar, a packet, a meeting with Voss. The stranger was no phantom but a player in the drama, and Voss was at its center. She thought of a village scandal years ago, when a stranger's deliveries had masked a smuggling ring. The goods passed in plain sight. This man, she suspected, was Voss's accomplice. His satchel, a vessel for something illicit perhaps, sketches, perhaps money, perhaps proof of a darker deed. Thank you, Dolly, Miss Marple said, setting her cup down. You've given me much to think about. I believe I'll have a word with Inspector Craddock. These village whispers, you know, are often louder than they seem. Mrs. Bantry grinned, her eyes sparkling. You're up to something, Jane, I can tell. You'll have this mystery solved before Craddock knows what's hit him. Miss Marple smiled, rising with her handbag. I hope so, Dolly, but mysteries, like gardens, need patience to bloom. She left Gossington Hall, her mind alight with the new details. The stranger, now with a scar and a packet, was a link to Voss, and Voss, she was certain, was the pivot on which the case turned. His ledgers, his sales, his meetings, they held the truth, if only she could reach it. At the police station, she found Craddock poring over reports, his desk a chaos of papers. Miss Marple, he said, looking up with a weary smile, I might have known you'd be back. What's it now? A man in a dark coat, she said, settling into a chair, with a scar on his cheek, seen near the studio, and with Mr. Voss. Mrs. Price saw him hand Voss a packet, and others have placed him near the studio, before Langston vanished. I think, Inspector, you might look into Mr. Voss's associates. A courier, he called him, but I suspect he's more than that. Craddock's pen paused, his brow furrowing. A scar, you say? That's new? We've had no reports of anyone like that, but I'll put Mills on it. Voss's ledgers are coming tomorrow. Subpoenaed them after your call. If there's anything fishy, we'll find it. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. I'm sure you will, Inspector, and perhaps check on that black car seen near the studio. It may belong to our stranger. She rose, her umbrella in hand, and left the station, her mind weaving the whispers into a pattern. The stranger, the packet, the car, they were threads leading to Voss. And Voss, she suspected, was playing a game far larger than art. As she walked home, the village lights twinkling in the dusk, she felt the puzzle tightening, the truth drawing closer, like a canvas revealing its hidden sketch under the right light. Chapter 9. The hidden room. The morning, in St. Mary Mead, dawned crisp and clear. The kind of day that made the village's thatched roofs and tidy gardens seem almost too perfect to harbor secrets. Miss Jane Marple, however, knew better. Her mind was still turning over the whispers of the stranger in the dark coat, his scarred cheek, and his clandestine meeting with Reginald Voss. These threads, woven with the crimson canvas and the suspect's guarded tales, suggested a scheme that went beyond a simple disappearance. Determined to find a new piece of the puzzle, she resolved to revisit Victor Langston's studio, certain that its walls held more than paint and shadows. She telephoned Inspector Craddock early, her voice as calm as ever. Inspector, I wonder if I might have another look at Mr. Langston's studio. There's a feeling I have, call it an old woman's whim, that we've overlooked something. Craddock's sigh was audible through the line, but his tone held a grudging respect. You and your feelings, Miss Marple. I'll send Mills to meet you there in an hour. But don't touch anything. The place is still a crime scene. Of course, Inspector, she replied, her smile unseen but present. She gathered her handbag, slipped her knitting inside, and set out for the studio, her umbrella tapping the path like a metronome. The village was stirring with its usual rhythm, children scampering to school, the postman whistling on his rounds, but Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on the barn, its ivy-clad walls, a silent witness to fate. Sergeant Mills was waiting when she arrived, his young face a mix of curiosity and mild exasperation. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, unlocking the studio door. "The lads have been over this place top to bottom, but the inspector says you're to have a look. Mind you, don't disturb anything." "I wouldn't dream of it, Sergeant," Miss Marple said, stepping inside with her usual air of mild deference. The studio was, as she remembered, brushes scattered on a workbench, jars of pigment catching the light, sketches pinned to the walls like fragments of Langston's mind. The easel stood empty, the crimson canvas still in police custody. But the air felt heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath. She moved slowly, her eyes scanning every surface, her fingers itching to explore, but restrained by Craddock's warning. The police had dusted for prints, catalogued the paints, and photographed the scene, but Miss Marple knew that official searches often missed the human touch, the small, overlooked detail that spoke of intent or haste. She paused by the workbench, where the overturned tin of vermilion paint still lay, its smear on the floor a faint echo of the canvas. But it was the wall behind the easel that drew her attention, its wooden panels slightly uneven, as if warped. "By time, Sergeant," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "Would you mind tapping this wall for me? Just here, behind the easel?" Mills raised an eyebrow, but complied, his knuckles rapping against the wood. The first few taps produced a solid thud, but as he moved to the right, the sound changed a hollow echo that made him pause. "That's odd," he said, tapping again. "Sounds like there's a space behind this." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "Indeed," she said. "Perhaps there's a latch or a panel. Studios, you know, often have hidden corners, places for sketches or supplies or secrets," she thought, but did not say. Mills ran his fingers along the panel, pressing gently until a soft click sounded. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow door, barely wide enough for a person to pass through. Beyond it was a small, dimly lit room, its air thick with the smell of dust and turpentine. Mills fetched a torch from his pocket, its beam illuminating a cluttered space, a table strewn with sketches, a ledger book, and a half-finished painting that mirrored one Miss Marple had seen in Voss's records, sold to a collector in Paris. "Well, I'll be," Mills muttered, stepping inside. "How did we miss this?" Miss Marple followed, her eyes darting over the contents. The sketches were unmistakably Langston's studies of landscapes, figures, and faces, some bearing Elise Duval's likeness. But it was the ledger that drew her attention, its pages filled with neat columns of figures, names, and dates. She peered at it, careful not to touch, and noted payments to a J. Harris, not Langston, for sums far larger than an artist's supplies would warrant. Sergeant Crousset, pointing to the ledger, "This must go to Inspector Craddock at once," and the painting look at the signature. "It's not quite right, is it? A touch too angular, as if copied." Mills squinted at the canvas, his brow furrowing. "You're right, Miss Marple. It's close, but off. Like someone tried to mimic Langston's hand." He made a note, his earlier skepticism replaced by a grudging admiration. "How did you know to look for this?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. People, Sergeant, are like houses. They have their hidden rooms, their secret corners. One only needs to listen for the hollow sound. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, when a hidden compartment in a desk had revealed a will that appended a family's fortunes. This room, she suspected, was Langston's prison or his workshop, used by another to profit from his name. They sealed the room, Mills calling for a constable to guard it until Craddock could arrive. As they stepped back into the studio, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the sketches, one of which showed a man's face scarred on the cheek, his eyes shadowed under a hat. J. Harris, she murmured, the name linking to the stranger in the dark coat. Voss's courier, perhaps, or something more, a partner in a scheme that turned Langston's art into a lie. Back at the police station, Craddock was waiting, his desk even more chaotic than before. A hidden room, he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and excitement, as Mills recounted their find, and a ledger with payments to this Harris fellow. That's something solid, Miss Marple. We've got Voss's ledgers coming today, too maybe. We'll find a match. Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chair. I believe you will, Inspector. And that painting the signature is wrong, just as I noticed in one of Mr. Voss's records. I suspect Mr. Langston was not painting for himself in that room, but for someone else. A forgery, perhaps, to feed a hungry market. Craddock's eyes widened. Forgery? You think Voss is behind this? Kidnapping Langston to churn out fakes? It's possible, Miss Marple said softly. But we mustn't leap too far. The ledger, the stranger, the canvas there, pieces of a pattern. Mr. Voss is clever. But clever people often leave traces, like footprints, in wet paint. She thought of a village swindler, years ago, whose meticulous records had betrayed his thefts, his confidence, his undoing. Craddock leaned back, rubbing his temples. I'll have the lads go over that room with a fine-tooth comb, and work tracking this Harris scar on his cheek. Dark coat. Sounds like your stranger. If he's tied to Voss, we'll find him. Miss Marple rose, her handbag in hand. Thank you, Inspector. I think I shall take a walk to the Blue Boar Inn. Miss Duval might have seen this Harris, even if she didn't know his name. And young Timothy, his fear, may tell us more than he intends. As she left the station, the village was settling into its evening rhythm, the lights of cottages glowing like stars. Miss Marple's mind was alight with the hidden rooms, secrets, the sketches, the ledger, the forged signature. They pointed to Voss, to Harris, to a scheme that turned art into deception. But where was Langston? Was he a victim, locked away, or a reluctant accomplice? She recalled a young man in St. Mary Mead, coerced into crime by a stronger will, his silence bought with promises. Langston, she suspected, was caught in a similar trap. His genius exploited for profit. At her cottage, she paused by the window, gazing out at the darkened village. The hidden room was a breakthrough, but the puzzle was not yet complete. Voss, Harris, the crimson canvas, they were all part of a larger design, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience and sharp eyes, was determined to see it through. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its polished wooden floor and faded curtains, was an unlikely stage for a drama. Yet it hummed with tension as Miss Jane Marple entered, her black handbag tucked under her arm. The morning was bright, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, but the air inside was heavy with anticipation. Inspector Craddock had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to her request to gather the 4 suspects: Timothy Wren, Lady Beatrice, Harrow, Elise Duval, and Reginald Voss for what she called a little discussion. Craddock, his patience worn thin by the case's twists, had warned her, "This better not be one of your theatrical ploys, Miss Marple." But his trust in her instincts had won out. The suspects sat in a semicircle of chairs, their faces a study in contrasts. Timothy's pale nervousness, Beatrice's rigid dignity, Elise's guarded elegance, and Voss's polished composure. Sergeant Mills stood by the door, his notebook ready, while Craddock leaned against the table, his expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Miss Marple, standing near the center, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, appeared as unassuming as ever, but her clear blue eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice gentle, but carrying the quiet authority of one who knew her ground. "I'm no policeman, as you know, but I've been thinking about Mr. Langston's disappearance, and I believe we're close to the truth. It's a matter of seeing the pattern, you see, like a piece of knitting, where one wrong stitch can unravel the whole." Timothy shifted uneasily, his hands twisting in his lap. Beatrice's lips pursed, her gloved fingers tightening on her handbag. Elise's dark eyes flicked toward Voss, who smiled faintly, as if amused by the proceedings. Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational, but deliberate. "The crimson canvas in the studio was meant to shock us, to suggest violence, but it was paint, not blood, and its purpose was to mislead. Someone wanted us to think Mr. Langston was dead or gone for good. But why?" She turned to Timothy, her gaze kind but probing. "Mr. Wren, you spoke of Mr. Langston's fear of betrayal, of someone selling his soul. You were loyal to him, weren't you? Yet you argued with Mr. Voss, outside the studio, about a plan. What was it?" Timothy's face drained of color, his voice a stammer. I didn't argue. Not really. Mr. Voss was just asking me to keep an eye on Victor's work, to make sure he finished his paintings. I didn't know what he meant, I swear." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes moving to Beatrice. "Lady Harrow, your pride in Mr. Langston's work is admirable, but you knew he was troubled by Mr. Voss's sales. You dismissed his concerns as artistic temperament, yet you bought paintings from Voss paintings with signatures that weren't quite right. Did you never suspect?" Beatrice's chin lifted, her voice icy. "I trusted Mr. Voss's judgment. Victor's complaints were childish. He wanted to hoard his work, not share it. I saw no fault in the paintings I purchased." But her eyes flickered, betraying a doubt she would not voice. Miss Marple turned to Elise, her tone softening. "Miss Duval, you loved Mr. Langston, didn't you? Not just as an artist, but as a man. Yet your fingers bore traces of crimson paint, like the canvas. Were you protecting him, or someone else?" Elise's breath caught, her hands clenching. "I told you, it was from my sketching. Victor was alive when I left him. I'd never hurt him." Her voice trembled, but her eyes held a spark of defiance. Finally, Miss Marple faced Voss, her gaze steady. "Mr. Voss, you're a clever man, skilled at turning art into profit. But the ledger in the hidden room, the one we found yesterday, shows payments to a J. Harris, not Mr. Langston, and a painting there, with a forged signature, matches one you sold. You kidnapped Victor Langston, didn't you? To force him to produce sketches for forgeries, to flood the market with fakes, while his name still commanded high prices." Voss's smile faltered, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "That's preposterous," he said, his voice smooth but strained. "Victor was my client, my friend. I'd never harm him. Your hidden room proves nothing, just sketches and a ledger. Where's the evidence?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. "The evidence, Mr. Voss, is in the details. The stranger with the scarred cheek, Cure Courier, J. Harris, was seen handing you a packet, likely sketches from Langston. The black car near the studio, the payments in the ledger, the forged signature, they all point to you. The crimson canvas was your mistake, a dramatic flourish to suggest murder and divert suspicion. But it was too theatrical, too unlike Langston's work. You underestimated him and us." Timothy gasped, his eyes wide. Beatrice's hand flew to her pearls, her face paling. Elise's gaze dropped, tears glistening. Voss laughed, a brittle sound. "A charming story, Miss Marple, but pure conjecture. You've no proof, Langston's even alive. Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. Actually, Mr. Voss, we do. My men followed your courier, Harris, to a cottage in Kent. Langston's there, weak but alive, locked in a room with his paints. Harris is in custody, and he's talking. Your game's up. Voss's composure shattered, his face twisting with anger. You've nothing on me, he snapped, but his voice betrayed him, cracking under the weight of truth. Harris acted alone. I only sold the paintings. Miss Marple shook her head, her expression almost pitying. You sold more than paintings, Mr. Voss. You sold Mr. Langston's freedom, his art, his soul. Greed, you see, is a poor artist. It always leaves a mark. Craddock nodded to Mills, who moved toward Voss with handcuffs. The dealer's shoulders slumped, his charm dissolving like paint in turpentine. The other suspects sat frozen, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Miss Marple stepped back, her role complete, her mind already turning to the quiet of her cottage. As Voss was led away, Craddock approached her, his expression a blend of awe and exasperation. You did it again, Miss Marple. How did you know? She smiled, her eyes twinkling. People, Inspector, are like canvases. They try to paint over their secrets, but the truth always shows through, if you look closely enough. She thought of a village scandal, years ago, when a merchant's greed had unraveled under scrutiny, his lies as clear as day. Voss, she knew, was no different. With a nod to Craddock, she left the hall, her umbrella tapping the floor. The village was stirring, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction, but the puzzle was not yet complete. Langston was alive, but his story and those of the others still held shadows to be explored. Chapter 11. The dealer's downfall. The twilight over St. Mary Mead was soft and golden, casting long shadows across the village green as Miss Jane Marple made her way home from the village hall. The confrontation with Reginald Voss had left a ripple of excitement in the air, but for Miss Marple, it was merely another stitch in the intricate pattern of the case. Her mind, as ever, was alert, sifting through the details of Voss's confession and the rescue of Victor Langston. The dealer's polished facade had crumbled, revealing a scheme as audacious as it was cruel, but there were still threads to be tied off. Questions that lingered like the last notes of a song. At the police station, Inspector Craddock was in high spirits, a rare smile breaking through his usual stern demeanor. The news of Langston's rescue had arrived, just as Voss was being led away in handcuffs, and the station was abuzz with activity. Miss Marple, invited to hear the details, sat in Craddock's office, her knitting bag at her feet, her expression as serene as if she were discussing the weather. You were right, Miss Marple, Craddock said, leaning back in his chair, a stack of reports before him. We found Langston in a cottage in Kent, just as you suspected. Weak, half-starved, but alive. He was locked in a room with his paints, forced to produce sketches for Voss's forgeries. Harris, the courier with the scar, spilled everything said. Voss paid him to keep Langston hidden and deliver the sketches to London. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she drew her knitting from her bag, her hands moving with the rhythm of thought. And the crimson canvas, Inspector, was that Mr. Harris's work, or Mr. Voss's? Craddock's brow furrowed. Harris's, it turns out. He admitted to painting it, under Voss's orders, to stage a crime scene. Thought it would make us think Langston was dead, throw us off the trail. Used vermilion and cadmium red, same as the tin in the studio. Overdid it, those too dramatic, as you said. Langston had nothing to do with it. He was already gone by then. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gleaming behind her spectacles. A mistake, that canvas. Mr. Voss wanted a distraction, but it was too bold, too unlike Mr. Langston's hand. Greed, you see, often overreaches. It paints with too broad a brush. She thought of a village swindler, years ago, whose flamboyant lies had betrayed him as surely as a forged signature. Voss, she suspected, had underestimated both Langston's resilience and the village's watchful eyes. Craddock flipped through his notes, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. Langston's statement backs it up. Voss lured him to the cottage with a promise of a new patron, then locked him in, threatened to ruin his reputation if he didn't cooperate. Langston played along, hoping for a chance to escape, but Voss had Harris watching him day and night. The sketches in that hidden room, they were the templates for the fakes. Voss sold them as originals, pocketing thousands. Miss Marple's lips pursed, a faint frown creasing her brow. And the others, Timothy, Lady Harrow, Miss Duval. They know of this scheme? Craddock shook his head. Not according to Langston. Timothy was just a pawn, too loyal to question Voss's visits to the studio. Lady Harrow bought the fakes in good faith, though she's furious now, says she'd sue Voss for every penny. As for Miss Duval, Langston says she suspected something was wrong but never knew the truth. She thought his moodiness was about their relationship, not captivity. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the suspects' roles. Timothy's fear, Beatrice's pride, Elise's secrets, they had been shadows cast by Voss's deception, not accomplices in it. Yet she wondered about Elise's crimson-stained fingers, a detail that still nagged at her. Miss Duval, she said softly, did she visit Mr. Langston in the cottage? No, Craddock said. Harris says she never came near. Her paint smudges must have been from her own sketching, like she said. Langston confirmed they'd been working on mixing pigments before he was taken. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. You don't think she's hiding something, do you? You've got that look, Miss Marple. She smiled, her expression as gentle as ever. Only a feeling, Inspector. Women like Miss Duval, they carry their secrets close, like a sketchbook, but I believe her heart was with Mr. Langston, not against him. She thought of a young woman in St. Mary Mead, years ago, whose love had led her to shield a man's faults, her silence a form of loyalty. Elise, she suspected, was not so different. Craddock stood, stretching. Well, Voss is in custody, and Harris too. We're cataloging the fakes, dozens of them, sold to collectors across Europe. Langston's shaken, but he'll recover. Wants to get back to his easel, he says. Can't thank you enough, Miss Marple. You saw through Voss when we were still chasing shadows. Miss Marple rose, gathering her bag. You give me too much credit, Inspector. I only listened to what the village and the suspects had to say. People, you know, are never as clever as they think. They leave their marks, like paint on a canvas. She paused at the door, her eyes twinkling. Do keep an eye on Mr. Langston, though. He's been through a great deal, and artists, they feel things deeply. As she left the station, the village was settling into its evening rhythm, the lights of cottages glowing against the dusk. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella tapping the path, her mind reflecting on the case. Voss's downfall was satisfying, but it was Langston's survival that warmed her heart. She thought of the hidden room, the forged signatures, the crimson canvas, all pieces of a scheme driven by greed, undone by the quiet observation of a village spinster at her cottage. She settled into her armchair, the fire crackling softly. Her knitting lay in her lap, but her thoughts were with Langston, imagining him back at his easel, painting the landscapes that had made him famous. She recalled a village artist, years ago, whose passion had outlasted his troubles, his work, a testament to resilience. Langston, she hoped, would find the same strength. As she picked up her needles, a knock at the door startled her. It was Clara, her maid, her face alight with news. Miss Marple, they're saying Mr. Langston back in the village. He's at the Blue Boar, with Miss Duval. Folks say he looks like a ghost, but he's alive. Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. Thank you, Clara. That's very good news indeed. The case was nearly complete, but she knew there would be one more chapter, a reunion, perhaps, or a final revelation. For now, she was content to knit, to listen, and to wait for the village to whisper its last secrets. Chapter 12. The painters returned. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke to a morning of soft mists, the kind that wrapped the cottages in a gentle haze, as if the world were holding its breath in the aftermath of Victor Langston's rescue. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a cup of tea and a slice of toast, felt a quiet satisfaction at the resolution of the case, though her mind lingered on the human threads that had woven it together. The news of Langston's return had spread like wildfire, and the village was abuzz with relief, curiosity, and the inevitable embellishments of gossip. Clara, her maid, had been full of it, reporting that Langston was at the Blue Boar Inn, frail but determined, already talking of painting again. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, decided to pay a visit to the inn. There was something about the painter's survival that tugged at her thoughts, a final stitch to be set in place. She donned her coat and hat, her umbrella a precaution against the capricious July weather, and made her way along the familiar lanes, her steps measured, but purposeful. The village was alive with its usual rhythm, children playing, the milkman's cart rattling by, but there was a new lightness in the air, as if Langston's return had lifted a shadow from St. Mary Mead. At the Blue Boar, the parlor was crowded, with villagers eager for a glimpse of the painter. But Miss Marple's quiet presence parted the throng like a breeze through reeds. She found Victor Langston in the garden, seated at a table with Elise Duval, who hovered near him like a protective shadow. Langston was thinner than Miss Marple remembered from his exhibition days, his face pale and gaunt, but his eyes held a spark of the fire that had made his landscapes so vivid. Elise, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, was sketching in her book, though her gaze kept drifting to Langston with a tenderness that spoke louder than words. "Mr. Langston," Miss Marple said, approaching with her gentle smile, "I'm so pleased to see you safe. And you, Miss Duval, it's been a trying time for you both." Langston looked up, his expression weary but warm. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse, "I've heard of your part in this. I owe you my freedom, perhaps my life." He gestured to the chair opposite, and Miss Marple sat, her handbag resting on her knees. "It was the village, really," she said, her tone modest. "People talk, you know, and their words paint a picture as clear as any canvas. But tell me, Mr. Langston, how are you faring?" Langston's hands, stained with faint traces of paint, trembled slightly as he spoke. "Better now that I'm free. Voss, he was a devil. Lured me to that cottage with talk of a new patron, then locked me away. Said he'd ruin my name if I didn't give him sketches, dozens of them, for his forgeries. I tried to resist, but he had Harris watching me, always with threats." His voice broke, and Elise reached for his hand, her touch steadying him. Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. "And the crimson canvas?" she asked gently. "You had no hand in it?" Langston shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "That was Harris's work, on Voss's orders. They thought it would make people believe I was dead, or mad, a cruel trick, to tarnish my name while they sold their fakes. But you saw through it, Miss Marple." She nodded, her thoughts drifting to the hidden room, the forged signatures, the ledger with Harris's name. "It was too bold," she said. "Like a bad painting, it tried too hard to impress. But you, Mr. Langston, you kept your spirit, even in captivity. That's no small thing." Elise spoke then, her voice low but fierce. "Victor was strong, Miss Marple. He never gave up hope. I knew something was wrong, but I thought it was me, our arguments, my jealousy. I should have seen the truth." Her eyes glistened, and Miss Marple noted the guilt in them, a familiar weight from her own village tales. "You loved him," Miss Marple said softly, "and love can cloud the clearest eyes. I saw the paint on your fingers, you know, crimson, like the canvas. I wondered for a moment if you were hiding something, but it was your own sketching, wasn't it?" Elise nodded, her cheeks flushing. Yes, Victor taught me to mix colors, to see the world as he did. I was practicing that night, after I left him. When I heard about the canvas, I was afraid I'd done something wrong, or that someone would think I had. Miss Marple's smile was kind. Fear makes us all see shadows, my dear. But you've nothing to fear now. She turned to Langston. And you, Mr. Langston, what will you do next? He looked at Elise, his expression softening. Paint, he said simply. It's all I know. I've started a new piece of landscape, for you, Miss Marple, as a thank you. Not one of Voss's fakes, but something true. His voice held a quiet strength, and Miss Marple felt a warmth in her heart, like the glow of a well-tended fire. They talked a while longer, of art and healing, until Langston tired, and Elise insisted he rest. Miss Marple left them, her umbrella tapping the path as she walked home. The village was settling into its evening quiet, the lights of cottages twinkling like stars. At her cottage, she hung the new painting Langston had sent, a serene view of St. Mary Mead's hills, its colors soft but vibrant above her mantel. It was a reminder, she thought, of the resilience of the human spirit, and of the truths that lay beneath the surface. That evening, as she sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap, Clara burst in with the latest news. Miss Marple, they're saying Mr. Voss has confessed everything. Tried to pin it all on Harris, but the police have proof, those ledgers, and the sketches. And Lady Harrow's in a right state, demanding her money back for the fakes. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile serene. Thank you, Clara, it's as I expected. Greed, you see, always leaves a trail. She thought of a village merchant, years ago, whose ambition had undone him, his secrets laid bare by the simplest clues. Voss was no different, his downfall written in the forged signatures and hidden rooms. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple reflected on the case. Timothy's loyalty, Beatrice's pride, Elise's love, Voss's greed, they were all part of the human canvas, painted in shades of truth and deception. The crimson canvas, meant to mislead, had instead led her to the heart of the mystery. Its bold strokes a mirror to Voss's overreaching ambition. Langston's return was the final stroke, a restoration of order to a village that thrived on it. People, she murmured to herself, are like paintings. The truth lies beneath, if one knows where to look. With a final click of her needles, she set her knitting aside, content to let St. Mary Mead return to its quiet ways, until the next puzzle stirred her sharp mind to action.